In the early 20th century, Halifax, Nova Scotia was one of the most important ports in the British Empire. Its deep, ice-free harbour made it a strategic naval and commercial hub, especially during the First World War. By 1917, the city had swollen with military personnel, dock workers, merchant sailors, and refugees from across the Atlantic. Halifax was busy, loud, and tense. Convoys of troopships and cargo vessels assembled in the harbour under strict wartime security. The city lived with blackouts, patrols, and constant movement of ships carrying munitions, fuel, and supplies vital to the war effort. Despite this danger, daily life continued as usual. Children went to school, factories operated, and families lived packed tightly along the waterfront, unaware that Halifax was quietly becoming one of the most dangerous places in North America. On the morning of December 6, 1917, the harbour was already alive before dawn. Ships crowded the narrow channel that connected Bedford Basin to the outer harbour. Among them was the Norwegian vessel SS IMO, chartered to carry relief supplies to Belgium. Delayed for days due to paperwork and coal shortages, IMO was eager to leave Halifax and had been granted permission to depart that morning. At the same time, the French cargo ship SS Mont Blanc was entering the harbour. Mont Blanc was no ordinary vessel. It was carrying a lethal cargo, high explosives intended for the European front. Deep in its hold were thousands of tons of picric acid, TNT, benzol, and gun carton. The ship flew no warning flags advertising its dangerous contents, partly due to wartime secrecy and partly because regulations were lax and inconsistently enforced. The Narrows demanded careful navigation, with strict rules governing right-of-way. Ships entering the harbour were expected to keep to the right, while outbound vessels followed their own designated channel. That morning, confusion reigned. IMO had drifted into the wrong side of the channel, moving faster than allowed. Mont Blanc, constrained by its explosive cargo, moved cautiously. As the two ships approached each other, both crews grew alarmed. Signals were exchanged, whistles blown in warning, but they were misunderstood or ignored. Each ship expected the other to yield. Seconds passed, then moments, and still neither altered course enough to prevent disaster. At approximately 8:45 a.m., IMO struck Mont Blanc on its starboard bow. The collision itself was not especially violent, and initially it seemed like a manageable maritime accident. But the impact toppled barrels of benzol stacked on the deck of Mont Blanc. Benzol, a highly flammable fuel, spilled across the deck and into the hold. Sparks from scraping metal ignited the vapor almost instantly. Flames spread rapidly across the ship, fed by volatile chemicals and fanned by the cold December wind. Within moments, Mont Blanc was engulfed in fire. The crew of Mont Blanc knew exactly what was happening. They understood that their ship was a floating bomb. With no realistic way to fight the blaze and no warning system to alert the city, the crew abandoned ship, rowing desperately toward the Dartmouth shore. As they fled, they shouted warnings in French, but few understood them. On shore, people gathered to watch the burning ship drift slowly toward Pier 6 in the Richmond district of Halifax. Fires were not uncommon in the harbour, and many residents were curious rather than afraid. Children were pulled from classrooms to watch the spectacle. Dock workers paused their labour. Firefighters prepared to respond, unaware that they were facing an inferno beyond anything in human experience. For roughly 20 minutes, Mont Blanc burned. The flames penetrated deeper into the ship, heating the explosives stored below deck. Pressure built relentlessly. At 9:04 and 35 seconds a.m., the ship detonated. The explosion was the largest man-made blast the world had ever seen at that time, surpassing anything produced by artillery or bombs. In a fraction of a second, Mont Blanc disintegrated. The blast released energy equivalent to several thousand tons of TNT. The harbour vanished in a blinding white flash, followed by a wall of force that expanded outward at unimaginable speed. The explosion obliterated the Richmond district of Halifax. Buildings were flattened as if made of paper. Steel beams twisted. Brick walls collapsed into dust. The shockwave traveled faster than sound, shattering windows miles away and knocking people unconscious where they stood. A massive fireball rose thousands of feet into the sky, followed by a towering column of smoke shaped like a mushroom. The blast generated temperatures so extreme that human bodies near the epicenter were vaporized instantly. Ships in the harbor were thrown onto shore or sunk outright. The anchor of Mont Blanc, weighing over half a ton, was hurled several miles and embedded itself deep into the ground. The explosion also created a tsunami. A wall of water surged outward from the blast site, rising more than 50 feet in some places. The wave swept people into the harbor, crushed wharves, and carried debris far inland. Then the water rushed back, dragging wreckage and bodies into the sea. The combination of blast, fire, and flood left the northern end of Halifax completely destroyed within seconds. More than 1,600 buildings were demolished, and thousands more were severely damaged. The human toll was catastrophic. Nearly 2,000 people were killed, many instantly, others trapped beneath rubble or burned alive in the fires that followed. Over 9,000 were injured, with thousands blinded or maimed by flying glass and debris. Eye injuries were especially common, as many people had rushed to windows to watch the burning ship moments before it exploded. Hospitals were overwhelmed almost immediately. Doctors, nurses, and volunteers worked in conditions of chaos, often without electricity, heat, or adequate supplies. Surgeries were performed by lantern light. Makeshift hospitals were established in schools and churches. Medical staff worked without rest, amputating limbs and treating burns on a scale never before seen in Canada. Fires raged across Halifax throughout the day, fed by ruptured gas lines and shattered stoves. Firefighters had been killed in the initial blast, and water mains were destroyed, making firefighting nearly impossible. As night fell, a fierce winter storm moved in, dumping snow and plunging the city into freezing temperatures. Survivors huddled in ruins or crowded into emergency shelters, many without proper clothing or blankets. The snow both worsened suffering and helped smother some fires, creating a grim paradox of relief and misery. News of the disaster spread with remarkable speed despite the near-total destruction of Halifax's communication infrastructure. Many telegraph lines were severed, offices were destroyed, and trained operators were killed or injured in the blast. Even so, fragments of information escaped the city through surviving rail connections and nearby towns. Within hours, communities across Nova Scotia were aware that Halifax had been devastated by a catastrophe beyond ordinary measure. As reports became clearer, cities throughout Canada and the northeastern United States grasped the enormity of the event, prompting an urgent and coordinated response that transcended national boundaries. Aid mobilized almost immediately. Trains were assembled in haste, carrying medical personnel, bandages, surgical tools, food, and clothing. Boston's response stood out for both its speed and scale. Despite a severe winter storm that threatened to halt rail traffic, the city dispatched a fully equipped medical relief train within hours of learning of the explosion. When it arrived in Halifax less than 24 hours later, doctors and nurses stepped into a city buried under snow, smoke, and silence. Their efforts, combined with aid from across Canada, saved countless lives and forged a lasting bond between Halifax and Boston, one rooted in shared sacrifice and sustained through decades of remembrance. In the weeks following the explosion, Halifax confronted the immense challenge of recovery. Entire neighborhoods had been erased in seconds, leaving thousands homeless as winter tightened its grip on the city. Temporary housing camps were constructed rapidly, but conditions were harsh and overcrowded. Survivors faced not only physical hardship but profound emotional trauma as they searched for missing relatives and attempted to make sense of their loss. Bodies continued to be recovered from rubble and the harbor for months, prolonging grief and uncertainty. Funeral services became a constant presence in daily life, turning mourning into a shared civic experience. As immediate relief efforts gave way to long-term planning, Halifax embarked on one of the most ambitious reconstruction projects in Canadian history. City planners sought not merely to rebuild what had been destroyed, but to correct structural weaknesses that had amplified the disaster's impact. Modern urban planning principles were applied to the devastated districts, resulting in wider streets, improved zoning, stronger building materials, and better access to services. These changes made the city safer and more resilient, but they also altered its social fabric. Many working-class residents found themselves displaced, unable to return to neighborhoods reshaped by new standards and rising costs. The question of responsibility cast a long shadow over recovery. Investigations and legal proceedings attempted to determine how such a disaster could occur in a busy wartime harbor. Testimony revealed a series of failures: poorly enforced navigation rules, inadequate communication between ships, lax oversight of hazardous cargo, and a culture of wartime secrecy that prioritized military necessity over civilian safety. Despite these findings, accountability remained elusive. Legal battles stretched on for years, and blame was divided among ship crews and harbor authorities, leaving many survivors deeply dissatisfied with the outcome. The human consequences of the explosion extended far beyond the immediate aftermath. Thousands of survivors lived with permanent injuries, particularly blindness caused by flying glass. Children orphaned by the disaster were absorbed into institutions or extended families already strained by loss. Psychological trauma, though poorly understood at the time, lingered for decades, shaping lives in quiet and often unacknowledged ways. Fear of the harbor, recurring nightmares, and profound grief became part of the unseen legacy of the explosion. Yet amid the suffering, the Halifax explosion revealed extraordinary resilience and compassion. Ordinary citizens risked their lives to rescue neighbors from burning buildings and collapsed homes. Medical workers performed exhausting, often harrowing labor under extreme conditions, making impossible decisions with limited resources. The international response demonstrated the capacity for solidarity even during a global war, showing that humanitarian action could rise above national conflict. Today, the Halifax explosion remains a defining moment in the city's history. Memorials mark the site where Mont Blanc exploded, while museums preserve artifacts and testimonies that keep the memory alive. Annual commemorations honor the dead and reaffirm the city's commitment to remembrance. More than a century later, the explosion endures as a powerful reminder of the dangers of human error and industrial negligence, and as a testament to the strength, endurance, and unity of a community that rebuilt itself from unimaginable devastation.